This is Chapter 1, Part 3 of The Rape of the Mind, The Psychology of Thought Control, Menticide, and Brainwashing by Just A.M. Merleau, M.D. Witchcraft and Torture. The specific techniques used in the modern world to break man's mind and will and to extort confessions for political propaganda purposes are relatively new and highly refined. Yet enforced confession itself is nothing new. From time immemorial, tyrants and dictators have needed these voluntary confessions to justify their own evil deeds. The knowledge that the human mind can be influenced, tamed, and broken down into servility is far older than the modern dictatorial concept of enforced indoctrination. The primitive shaman used awe-inspiring ritual to bring his victim into such a state of fright hypnosis that he yielded to all suggestions. The native on whom a spell of doom has been cast by the medicine man may become so hypnotized by his own fear that he simply sits down, accepts his fate, and dies. And that was said by Malinowski. Throughout history, men have had an intuitive understanding of the mind that can be manipulated. Elaborate strategies have been worked out to achieve this end. Ecstasy rituals, frightening masks, loud noises, eerie chants, all have been used to compel the crowd to accept the beliefs of their leaders. Even if an ordinary man at first resists a cruel shaman or medicine man, the hypnotizing ritual gradually breaks his will. More painful methods are not new either. When we study the old reports of the Inquisition or of the many witch trials both in Europe and America, we learn a great deal about these methods. The floating test is one example. Those accused of witchcraft were thrown into the river, their feet and hands tied together. If the body did not sink, the victim was immediately pulled out of the water and burned at the stake. The fact that he did not sink was proof positive of his guilt. If, on the other hand, the accused obeyed the law of gravity and sank to the bottom of the river, the drowned body was ceremoniously removed from the river and proclaimed innocent. Not much choice was left to the victim. In either case, his goose was cooked, right? Man has been tremendously inventive in developing means for inflicting suffering on his fellow man. With refined passion, he has devised techniques which provoke the most exquisite pain in the most vulnerable parts of the human body. The rack and the thumb screw are age-old instruments and have been used not only by primitive judges, but also by so-called civilized dictators and tyrants. In order better to understand modern mental torture, we must constantly keep in mind the fact that from the earliest days, bodily anguish and the rack were never meant merely to inflict pain on the victim. They may not have expressed their understanding in sophisticated terms, but the medieval judge and hangman were nevertheless aware that there is a peculiar spiritual relationship and mental interplay between the victim and the rest of the community. Much painful torture and hanging had to be done as public demonstrations. After suffering the most intense pain, the witch would not only confess to shocking sexual debaucheries with the devil, but would herself gradually come to believe the stories she had invented and would die convinced of her guilt. The whole ritual of interrogation and torture finally compelled her to yield to the fantasies of her judges and accusers. In the end, she even yearned for death. She wanted to be burned at the stake in order to exorcise the devil and expiate her sins. These same judges and hangmen realized, too, that their witch trials were intended not only to torture the witches, but even more to torture the bystanders who, albeit unconsciously, identified themselves with the victims. This is, of course, one of the reasons burnings and hangings were held in public and became the occasion for great pageants. Terror thus became widespread, and many judges spoke euphemistically of the preventative action of such torture. Psychologically, we can see this entire device as a blackmailing of human sympathy and the general tendency to identify with others. As far back as 1563, the courageous Dutch physician Johannes Weir published his masterwork De Prestigiis Daemonum on the delusions about demons, in which he states that the collective and voluntary self-accusation of older women, through which they exposed themselves to torture and death by their inquisitors, was in itself an act inspired by the devil, a trick of demons, whose aim it was to doom not only the innocent women but also the reckless judges. Weir was the first medical man to introduce what became the psychiatric concept of delusion and mental blindness. Wherever his book had influence, the persecution of witches ceased. In some countries, more than 150 years before it was finally brought to an end throughout the civilized world. His work and his insights became one of the main instruments for fighting the witch delusion and physical torture. Auschwitz. Weir realized even then that witches were scapegoats for the inner confusion and desperation of their judges and of the zeitgeist in general. The refinement of the rack. All knowledge can be used either for good or for evil, and psychology is not immune to this general law. Psychology has delivered up to man new means of torture and intrusion into the mind. We must be more and more aware of what these methods and techniques are if we are successfully able to fight them. They can often be more painful and mentally more paralyzing than the rack. Strong personalities can tolerate physical agony. Often it serves to increase stubborn resistance. No matter what the constitution of the victim, physical torture finally leads to a protective loss of consciousness. But to withstand mental torture leading to creeping mental breakdown demands an even stronger personality. What we call brainwashing, a word derived from the Chinese "see now," is an elaborate ritual of systematic indoctrination, conversion, and self-accusation used to change non-communists into submissive followers of the party. That's Hunter. Menticide is a word coined by me and derived from mens, the mind, and caedere, to kill. And then there's a note. He says, here I followed the etymology used by the United Nations to form the word genocide, meaning the systematic destruction of racial groups. Back to the text. Both words indicate the same perverted refinement of the rack, putting it on what appears to be a more acceptable level. But it is 1,000 times worse and 1,000 times more useful to the Inquisitor. Menticide is an old crime against the human mind and spirit, but systematized anew. It is an organized system of psychological intervention and judicial perversion through which a powerful dictator can imprint his own opportunist thoughts upon the minds of those he plans to use and destroy. The terrorized victims finally find themselves compelled to express complete conformity to the tyrant's wishes. Through court procedures at which the victim mechanically reels off an inner record which has been prepared by his inquisitors during a preceding period, public opinion is lulled and thrown off guard. A real traitor has been punished, people think. The man has confessed. His confession can be used for propaganda, for the Cold War, to instill fear and terror, to accuse the enemy falsely, or to exercise a constant mental pressure upon others. And I'll stop it right there. And this was part 3 of chapter 1, The Rape of the Mind by Juice Merleau. And I'll see you in part 4.